Hello, and welcome to the Author Roundup, a special segment of the Book Connection Show where we meet up and coming indie authors and talk to them about their recently released books. Welcome to Author Roundup. I'm Jenny, and I'm delighted to have you join us for another great conversation with our guest indie author. He's a doctor of internal medicine and pediatrics who works for Mount Sinai Hospital in New York City. His interest in writing began in third grade when he wrote and acted out his first play in front of his class. He continued to write about events, politics, and sports through college, graduate school, to the present day. Despite busy days and frequent sleepless nights, he's been interested in writing fiction for most of his life. He has written poems and short stories about interesting situations and moments when people are at their worst, but also demonstrate remarkable strength and heroism. These stories are loosely based on people he encountered in almost over 30 years of practice as a medical doctor in major cities across the United States. So, here to tell us about his book, Cityscapes Anthology of Urban Short Stories and Poems, please welcome Dr. Bertrand Williams. Hi, Barry.
Hi,
Happy to
thank you
have
for
you
that
on the show.
introduction. That was wonderful.
Thank you for this opportunity to talk to you. So, I talked a little bit in the introduction about your career as a doctor. If you don't mind, Barry, can you tell us more about yourself?
Sure. Well, I grew up in New England. My father was originally from Cuba and lived a good part of his life in Jamaica as well before emigrating to the New York area after World War II. My mom was from Jamaica and he sent for her in the late 40s. And so we grew up in my family is both of my parents who've since, of course, passed away, but I have three other brothers and sister. And, growing up in New England, we went through all the seasons, the fall, the winter, spring, and summer. And we had our, differences and fights and,
Mhm.
got back together again like everybody else. As a child, I was sick. I had asthma quite badly
Mhm.
and was in the hospital often. And that's what I think made me interested in medicine initially. And as I got older, of course, my condition improved significantly. And so I ended up deciding that that was something I wanted to dedicate my life to, is making sure that other kids and adults didn't suffer the way I did. And so that's what led me to seek the medical profession and go into medical school. I attended Harvard University in college, in Cambridge, Mass, and then came back to the University of Connecticut, near where my parents lived at the time. And after that, went back to Boston to do my internship and residency in internal medicine at Boston City Hospital, which was part of Boston University, and my pediatric residency at Children's Hospital in Boston, as well as Boston City Hospital through the combined program. And I
Mhm.
graduated in 1992 and worked in Boston after that in a city-run clinic in the East Boston section for at least about 10 or 11 years before relocating out of the area.
Oh,
So that's in a nutshell, that's why I became interested in medicine and encountered all these stories.
I see. So, despite leading a very busy life, everything that you have said to us, I know it's not easy. But despite all that, you never lost your love of writing. And now you have a book out, Cityscapes. Please tell us more about it.
So when I was doing my residency in Boston in the 1980s, it was during the height of the AIDS epidemic. And
Mm,
I think people now may have an understanding of what that was like having come through a second pandemic. But at that time, we really had no idea what this disease was and why it was so lethal and who was at risk for getting it, let
mhm,
alone even, begin to treat it. And so I did see unbelievable acts of defiance, but acts of heroism as well. People literally putting their lives on the line for other people during this time, as we saw during this last pandemic as well. And I think that those stories stayed with me for many years. And in addition to that, of course, the day-to-day activities of just living in a city, and having different relationships over the years with different people led me to really want to write stories about these different kinds of experiences. And so I wanted to group them in a series of short stories so I had time to really reflect on all these things that I had seen and experienced.
I see. Is there anything in particular, like an event or whatever, aside from what you experienced during that time with AIDS and all that, everything that's happening around you? Is there anything in particular that inspired the idea for this book?
I would say probably the heroism I saw in people in the first few years of really the AIDS crisis ramping up. For
Mm-hmm.
example, I saw ambulance drivers coming in with people who were just in horrible condition and with blood and other things all over their bodies. And at the time, we weren't sure if AIDS could be contracted just by touching someone who had blood
Yeah.
on them. And
Mm-hmm.
and these ambulance drivers and nurses would literally, you know, put their hands on these patients to try and resuscitate them and save them, knowing that they could be putting their own lives at risk. So
Right.
these were stories and things I remember that really affected me quite deeply.
Mhm.
And people just sort of volunteering and coming in literally from off the street to donate their time to spend time with patients who we couldn't really save. We couldn't really do anything for them, but knew that they wanted to, have somebody nearby when their final time came, and volunteers just coming in and being that person for them. And at Boston City Hospital, we dealt with many homeless people, and many people had no resources. And seeing these kinds of things happen really affected me deeply, and maybe want to really understand what drives people to sacrifice everything for other people they don't even really know. And I think that that's something that of course led me to want to write these stories and sort of reflect on that, as well as just other stories about people going through daily life and people getting
Mm,
married or ending up in romantic fights and things like that. I also wanted to write about that too.
I see. So you mentioned that this is an anthology. It's a collection of short stories and poems. And but I noticed that there is a theme and it's connected to the four seasons of the year. Can you elaborate on that? Why did
Sure,
you choose to
sure.
present your book that way?
Sure. Well, cities are almost like organic beings, and cities go through the different seasons just like
Mm,
humans do. For example, in the spring, it's a time of
mhm,
awakening when new shops open up, new stores, people are starting to go out, they explore the parks after being cooped up in the wintertime in their apartments or their dwellings. The summertime is, of course, when people try to escape. They try to leave the urban density of the city, but that's also when people from outside the city come in and visit. And they
mhm,
look at those city environments with fresh eyes, maybe from things they've seen about that city in the movies or things they've read about in books on those cities. And this is any city in America, New York, Chicago, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Atlanta, and or even Miami. And I think it's really a transition time for the cities where things become a little bit more carefree
mhm,
and people are willing to talk to total strangers about mutual interests like sports or architecture, things like that. Of course, the fall is a different time when people are coming back from vacation. And it
mhm,
seems like in those moments, the city itself gets back to work.
mhm,
People get back into the office or people start getting back to school or kids start going to college for the first time or coming back from graduate school and going on to other things in their young professional lives. And so it's as if the city itself is starting to become more serious, getting back down to business, and the
mhm.
weather gets cooler. People start to congregate more indoors, but it's still nice enough that there's still time for some outdoor activities, albeit communal activities like going to sports games or going to the theater. And then the wintertime, of course, it almost seems like the city goes into a type of survival mode where people
Mm,
are rushing around and they're not outdoors very often. And this is even true in warmer climates where people are more likely to congregate together, closer together. They want to be close to their loved ones or close friends and family and rehash the summer or times they've had earlier in the year when the weather was nicer, or things they did together. And it seems like during that time, the city itself begins to look forward to new moments in celebration for the new year. And of course, looking forward to the spring, which is a renewal time. So
Mhm.
I did want to group those four seasons together and sort of emphasize how relationships between people in these urban settings changes during those seasonal changes.
I see. That's very interesting. Now, so when you were writing this book, who were you thinking of? Like, who is this book intended for? And then who would benefit the most from the book?
Well, the book is really for, I think, people 20 to 21 and up, and
Hmm.
it's really exploring themes of understanding the world through somebody else's eyes and understanding, for example, how people's lives can be different, but yet how people can have common interests. So, for example, in one of the stories in the end of the book, South Station, which takes place in Boston in the wintertime, it's about a couple breaking up and the dynamics between that and how even within this couple, the view of the relationship of the marriage from the perspective of the husband versus the wife is 180 degrees different. Even though they're experiencing the same thing, their
Mm,
view of that experience is completely different. And I wanted to sort of focus on those types of events where people have differences, but they also have a sort of shared experience. And that shared experience through life in an urban setting very often can be unique.
okay, so you said also that your stories are loosely based on people you have met, you have encountered over the years as a doctor. Now, can you tell us which character in which story is the most significant to you?
Well, I have to say that, in all honesty, listening to my wife's friends' exploits in the romantic field and as well as her own led me to really create the story of Miss Connecticut. And that's a play that's sort of based on these kinds of romantic relationships. And so I think that that's the character that seems to really come to life the most for me. So the play Miss Connecticut really is a reflection of the challenges that people have, women in particular, in an urban setting
Mhm.
with trying to meet, their counterpart, their male counterparts in this particular story, but it could be anybody. And the the challenges of really finding someone who is compatible with your own experiences and your own character. And so that was sort of the gist of that story.
Mm,
But that has a lot of meaning for me because, of course, my wife is with me and she's given me some details on her experiences and those exploits of other friends of hers, and I've sort of compiled that into that story.
I see. So you said it's a play, right? And it's part
Yes.
of the collection of short stories and poems that you have. If I ask you for the story or the poem that's the most special to you, which one would it be?
That would be my memoriam to the events of 9/11 in New York, called Big
Okay.
Brothers. And I think that has the most meaning for me. It took me 6 months after the events actually happened before I was able to write that because of all the emotions inside. I was just trying to figure out and process what I'd seen and felt. My wife and I had, ironically enough, just moved to New York just about 6 weeks earlier from
Mm,
Boston, and we moved to Lower Manhattan. So in our apartment, we could see the top 20 or 30 floors of the old World Trade Center every morning when
mm,
we woke up in our bedroom. And we used to go down to the World Trade Center frequently to have a coffee or jog around the area, which is near the Hudson River on the west side of New York, of Manhattan. So when these events occurred and the buildings came down, that was our neighborhood. And
Yeah.
when we were allowed to come back and enter back into our apartment building, we saw a fine coating of dust on the windows that were the remnants of the building and people who had been
Mhm.
pulverized and literally cremated. So the dust represented not just, building material, but it represented human beings. And I think that had a really significant and profound effect on my emotions. And the whole city just seemed to be in mourning at the time. People walked around very slowly. Nobody smiled. Nobody really said anything. People whispered to each other, even on the open sidewalk. And, people just were not able to, I think, comprehend at the time what happened. And 6 months later, I was able to finally put it into words that I
Mhm.
put on paper as a metaphor for how I thought, people felt. I know that's how I felt at the time in the city when I wrote it.
That must have been very painful for you to go through that. Imagine taking 6 months to come up with your poem. Could you read us a little bit of the poem, if you may?
Sure, I can do that for you. I'd be happy to. So it's titled Big Brother, Memoriam to the Terror Events of September 11th, 2001. You two were left at our doorstep at birth, a reminder of our haste and pride of life. We watched as you grew up tall and straight and reminded us of the brave new world upon us. Not everyone was joyful at your coming out party. Some made fun of you. Your shape was all wrong. You were too big. You had the kind of looks that defied beauty. But over time, you won over most of your critics. Your square, tall, and lean look was appreciated for its bare honesty about who you were, and your hard work and transformative effect on the neighborhood. We who hated you came to rely on your presence. Your mere gaze and glorious height gave us pause. Indeed, we looked up to you and saw ourselves, a reflection of the city and its people, brutally honest and willing to discard all pretensions for the sake of efficiency. In time, you became beautiful to us. So that's just an excerpt. I mean, there's more of it, but a
Mhm.
couple of paragraphs more, but that's the gist of it.
How did it help you writing that after 6 months?
Well, I think it was a kind of catharsis. I was able to really express how I felt about the moment, how I felt about the event as it occurred. And because we were watching on TV like anyone else, my wife and I were out of the city at the time, but we saw everything unfold. And we'd only, like I said, moved to the neighborhood a few weeks earlier. And more importantly, I think it expressed how I felt about the people of the city and their resilience
Mhm.
and the ability for the people of New York, as well as the people at the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., and the country as a whole, to come back from this, to bounce back and be stronger for it. I felt that that was a time when we all came together for a common cause, regardless of who we were or what our beliefs were. And to me, that was comforting. That made me feel stronger.
It was very helpful. And I'm sure people would still find that comfort when they read the poem that you made. So, Barry, we would also want to know more about your experience as an author. You said this is your first book. How long did it take for you to complete Cityscapes?
Well, the actual writing took about 8 months, but the stories
Mhm.
themselves took about 20 years to accumulate and, sort of compile, different poems at different times during that period. The short stories, some of them took maybe a few days, a couple of them took a week or two, but I think I just accumulated them like people would accumulate baseball cards as a kid.
Mhm.
I just sort of started, writing one story after another and putting them into the computer file. And one day I was talking to my wife and saying, I've got enough stories. I should really write a book. And she said, Yeah, you should write a book. Why don't you? You always talk about it. And so that was what spurred me to finally, you know, attempt to write this one and
Mhm.
get it published.
So you also said that you have always been interested in writing fiction. So how does it go? Like when inspiration strikes, you would write something and then would just go ahead and keep it over the years. You accumulated all of these short stories and poems and all that. Is that how it happened?
Yeah, that's kind of how it happens in certain ways. I mean, for example, if we're going on a trip and I see something beautiful that really, touches me deeply, I'll start generating in my head either a poem or a story about that. And in the case of these short stories, they're really kind of reflective of people I've spoken to where they've said a catchphrase or said something to me that just really struck me, or someone has told me their life experience, and I've just thought that it was unique enough that it would look good on paper to incorporate that experience into a character.
Mm.
And of course, people I've met personally at work and people I've taken care of, and learning about their families and exploring the dynamics of, the places I've worked in, the people I've worked with, as well as, people who are my neighbors or people who I may have spoken to in the past when I was younger. All that sort of will hit me at a moment in time that brings about a reflection. So, for example, the poem I just read, I
Mm-hmm.
really felt something when my wife and I walked down Greenwich Street in New York, which is in Lower Manhattan, leading to the site of the old World Trade Center, and we saw a vast open pit the size of a football field with white steam just popping out and coming, just pouring out of it, and firefighters just disappearing into the smoke and then just coming out with all their gear on and uniform and masks and ventilation units with oxygen tanks just coming in and
Mm-hmm.
going out and coming in, going out, just disappearing and coming out, carrying, remnants of materials and clothing from people who I guess just didn't even exist anymore. That kind of thing just really struck me hard. And, it never left me. I just kind of ruminated over that over and over again for that period of time until I was able to put it on paper.
Okay, so you've accumulated all of the material for the book very over a long period of time. Take us through your writing process or your writing journey. What's the most fun part of it, and then what's also difficult? I know it works both ways, right? It's not always easy. There are challenges to it. Take us through that journey.
Well, the most fun is creating the story.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, in the story Miss Connecticut, I had all these stories that women had told me, friends of my wife, over the years about their romantic relationships and how things sort of went awry or were unexpected. And I think I was talking to my wife one day, we were reminiscing about how we met. And
Mm-hmm.
all these stories just started coming out of that her friends had told me about their relationships. And so right then and there, as we were reminiscing, I think it was we had been married for about 10 years at that point, that I just started thinking about, gee, these stories are really funny. These are really good. I wonder if other people would find them as entertaining as I do. And that is the moment when inspiration hits and you think, okay, let me put this in a story format, in a play format. And that's the most joy, just
Mm-hmm.
beginning to create the idea of the story. And of course, the part that's the most challenging is when you actually do put it on paper, because then you have to go back and rewrite it.
Mm-hmm.
I think the rewriting process is can be challenging because you never, even now, I just feel like I never seem to have gotten it completely right. Like I'll read something in the book with a story and I'll think, gee, I could have done that better. I could have phrased that a little bit
Oh,
differently.
okay.
But, at the time, you're just happy to get it on paper and get through the themes of the story and then go back and do the revisions later on.
Mm. Yes, I think that's what most authors would find challenging, like the editing part and all that. But I could just imagine it must have been fun putting the book together since each story or each poem would remind you of something or someone, right?
Oh,
So
for sure.
it must have been really fun. Okay, so your book has been out for a couple of months, a few months now. Please tell us about the nicest feedback or review that you got about your book, and then what made it have the most impact for you.
Sure. Well, the nicest feedback I got was from someone who works with me in the medical office where I work. And I just peripherally mentioned that I'd written the book and it got published. But I didn't really tell her to buy it. I didn't expect her to buy it, but she bought it. And she came back and told me that, the poem, My Wife, really meant something to me. It really reached me. And I really enjoyed that. And I enjoyed the whole book. I read through it in a day. And it's a quick read, but it's really an enjoyable read and it's easy to get through. And I think I just really I enjoyed that and that she was captivated by that. And I have had another person tell me who I mean they're an acquaintance of ours, but I don't really know them that well. But
Mm-hmm.
she told my wife, who then told me that during reading one of the stories, one of the poems, Shadow of Wings, she actually cried during that moment because, yeah, of the theme of that poem, and it meant so much to her. So I really was touched by that. I didn't expect that kind of response by any stretch, but people seem to enjoy it. And people ask me if I'm writing another book or if I have another one coming out. So that makes me feel happy that maybe they do enjoy it and maybe they do like it. And I'm hoping
Mm-hmm.
that other people who read it feel the same about it as well.
Mhm. That must have been awesome hearing those compliments or the feedback from everyone and knowing that something you created touched someone's life. Okay,
Yeah.
so as an author this time to another fellow author, what advice can you give, especially to those who are just starting to write their books?
I would say don't be afraid to put pen to paper. Don't put yourself on a deadline. Just write the way you would tell a story to a friend or to a family
Mhm.
member. For me, I write the way I would ordinarily speak. So I write as if I'm talking to my wife and trying to explain to her what happened to a friend of mine. And I think that if you write in a way that people understand or in a way that people can sort of live those moments through the eyes of that character, I
Mhm.
think it brings something to the story. It fleshes it out for them and allows them to, I think allows them to enjoy it a little bit more.
How did you balance being a doctor and getting to write all of these poems and, short stories?
It wasn't easy, I'll tell you that. But, in between going to offices, going to the hospital, visit patients, and coming home late at night, sometimes I would take the weekends, sometimes a couple of days during the week where I had a couple of days off, or late at night, very often when my family was asleep, I'd come downstairs to the office and just write a few lines here and there and write a page or two at a time. And, if you're consistent with it and you work in a sort of, regular fashion in those spare moments, then you can find the time to do it.
So consistency is
Yeah.
the key.
Yeah. I
Okay.
mean, for me, it's always taking at least a few hours every other day to at least put pen to paper and write something out. And just even if it's just a basic sketch of a story, you
Mm,
can always come back
okay.
later.
Right. So tell us more about your personal and professional goals. It could be
Uh,
of your book or anything else you would want to achieve.
sure. Well, professionally, I'd like to continue to work as I'm doing in primary care and seeing patients. I would also like to, teach students, which we do. We work with the nurse practitioner students and medical students and residents, the next generation. I enjoy that a lot because I get to see medicine afresh through their eyes,
Mhm.
and they always challenge me about questions they ask, things I've never thought of. And from a writing perspective, I'd love to, frankly, selfishly see the book take off and do really well. That would really give me a great deal of encouragement. And as I said, I'm working on other stories, another one at this moment, and I'm hoping that it works out as well
Mhm.
for subsequent books that I may write in the future.
I see. So you're working on another book now.
Yes, this one is a book that takes place, is a storyline that takes place in Philadelphia. It's about redemption and second chances. So it's my hope that it's something that you know a general audience would be able to get through and understand. I mean,
Do
we've
you
all
see
had our
yourself?
moments. We've all had our moments where we've regretted certain things in life.
Okay, yes, I'm sure a lot of people can relate to that storyline. But Barry, do you see yourself writing a book in another genre? Probably not fiction this time, like something else.
Well, I've worked on certain grants in the past, and I've worked
Mm.
on nonfiction. I worked on a nonfiction medical case report many years ago with a colleague of mine. And so, yes, I could see that, at some point, but I truly love fiction. And
Yeah.
in fiction, you can just kind of make it up. Whereas in my day-to-day life, you can't make up anything. You have to really be as accurate as possible
Yes.
about
Yes.
everything because people's lives are on the line. So writing fiction is a kind of escape for my mind, a chance to explore alternative lives and alternative situations, and to sort of be freewheeling in
Mhm.
telling those stories.
Yeah.
And and so that's a kind of relief for me.
Just letting your imagination take off, right?
That's right. That's exactly right.
Okay. So, Barry, what is your final message to our viewers and listeners?
I think the overall theme of my book is really about, despite the differences that we all have in terms
Mhm.
of where we come from, what we speak, how we speak, our languages, and maybe our preferences in music and elsewhere, that we also share common themes. We share commonalities, and we all, for example, want to have a happy life. We all, if we have children, want our children to be better off than we were. We all want
Mhm.
to advance in our careers, and we all have our ups and downs. We all have arguments, but we understand that we're all part of the same family. And so I would like to emphasize to people that my book is really about sharing those commonalities as well as exploring our differences and having respect for each other, regardless of the view from the other person's eyes. I do think that we have much more in common as human beings and as people living in a society than we have differences. And I would hope that if they get through the whole book, if they read the whole thing, that they'll understand that's present in these stories as well.
That's beautiful and very relevant with the things that are going on around us. So, Barry, how can they get in touch with you if they would want to contact you, or perhaps your readers would want to communicate with you, give you feedback about your book?
Oh, sure. Well, I can be reached on Facebook. I have a Facebook page. I'm trying to establish a website now, but it's not up and running yet. And of course, people can contact me through iUniverse, I'm
Mhm.
sure, and they'll reach out to me as well. But I think that, if I am able to get a second book out, which is my hope, then, I'll have those things squared away and people can have a much easier time of reaching me.
Right. So, good luck on your second book. And I'm sure you still have a lot more to do with promoting this book and, getting in touch with your readers as well. So, I enjoyed so much talking to you, Barry, and our conversation about your book is very inspiring. I'm sure that everyone who's tuning in would also find perhaps a story or a poem that they can somehow relate to. So please invite everyone to grab a copy of your book.
Thank you. Thank you. And I appreciate this interview and I appreciate iUniverse for allowing me to do it. Thank you very much.
Okay, so to everyone watching and listening, please make sure you grab a copy of the book Cityscapes, Anthology of Urban Short Stories and Poems by B.W. Williams. It's available in Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com, iUniverse online bookstore, and other reseller sites. So it's available in paperback, hardback, and ebook. Okay, so thank you so much, Barry, for joining us today. And to everyone watching and listening, we hope you enjoyed this episode. We'll see you next time on the Author Roundup.